All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started reading some questions here for our panel. So, starting out, Gordy and Marty, since you're both sitting there, this is good. In developing the Northwest Forest Plan, what was the assumed role of riparian reserves to provide habitat for early successional species? What about riparian-associated sun-loving early successional species? Did that ever come up?
You know, it came up, but we were the direction for FEMAT was to focus on late successional conditions and species. But when you think about forest ecosystems, we all knew that we need to consider early cereal as well. But that wasn't an explicit sort of guiding principle or criterion. So it was always in the back of our minds, but not an explicit feature that we analyzed around.
Now that Lee's here, we can put this question to him. Is NetMap available for us to use, and will there be any training sessions on how to use it?
It is, you can download it now. But it's in 9.3 and making the transition to 10 this fall. And so all the databases will be rebuilt and the tools will be now in ARC 10, and there'll be some browsers. So if you go to the website, you'll see the information of how to access things. And we're adding a bunch of new things, like some of the riparian management tools you saw this morning, as well as, there's about 70 tools there now. But I couldn't go into it, but I'd be happy to if anybody else, after this session.
You might say that it's available to anybody, not just the agencies.
Right, it's available to everybody.
So if they go on Earth Institute?
No, it's www.netmaptools.org.
So just Google NetMap. And there's coverages in there for Oregon and Washington, west side right
It's Washington, Oregon, Northern California. It's either existing or pending funded. So it's funded, and probably by mid-next year, the whole map that you see on that site and that I showed today will be done. It's encompassing about 50 national forests, all the BLM lands in those states, as well as all lands, in fact, except for things like non-forested zones like the Willamette Valley and high deserts.
Next question. I've always assumed that the second tree height for buffers along fish-bearing streams was due to terrestrial species connectivity rather than aquatic concerns. Are there any values to that second tree height on fish-bearing streams for fish?
If you go back, and I've gone back and just looked at the FEMAT document, that second tree height was ostensibly a buffer on the buffer. There was concerns about potential microclimatic effects, clear cutting to the edge, and we wanted to minimize any potential adverse effects of that happening in terms of the microclimatic conditions in the riparian zone. So the justification for it was basically based on microclimatic concerns. There was discussion about it as a potential corridor for movement of terrestrial organisms, but when you go back and look in FEMAT, there is no mention of it. So it likely was, but there's no documentation for it.
Anything to add to that, Marty?
Yeah, I'll just say that that was definitely in the mind of those expert panels when they evaluated the alternatives, and that double width buffer featured prominently in adding additional protection and corridors, even if it wasn't an explicit statement. It was certainly in there for terrestrial organisms.
So I get ask a question because I'm in charge. So you had talked about the 130 species being mitigated for with that riparian. What about the other 270 some? What happened to them? They're just kind of out there?
Because
I think there was 400.
There were a whole set of different mitigations, and some of those species fell under the survey and manage mitigation. Some of them fell under other provisions in the matrix. The 130 were the ones where you could identify riparian as a key feature for each of those species.
Okay.
Yeah.
For Gordy, for streams where the primary source of wood is debris flows and landslides, can thinning of timber stands be used to enhance the amount or quality of wood recruitment? So does thinning help you with your debris flows and landslides?
Well, if you believe that thinning is going to get you bigger trees down the road, then yes, it does. If you're not going to get larger trees, then probably it won't. So it all depends on how you view the effect of thinning. If you get bigger trees, if thinning is going to develop bigger trees, I would say yes, it ultimately will be a net plus.
This is from our web chat people. Hello out there. For Gordy and Marty, what are your thoughts about adaptation planning for impending climate change efforts for aquatic conservation strategy and riparian reserves? Climate change effects. So how's climate change working into this ACS and riparian reserve strategy?
Well, 20 years ago, climate change wasn't even on our radar screen. I think what we have right now is a landscape where we preserved options by setting that riparian reserve network up that we may not have had if they weren't there. And options in terms of both the area we have in which to try different things, do different things, try management policies, but also we probably preserved an important part of the landscape for a number of organisms. I think what will happen exactly with climate change is going to vary tremendously across the planning area. A lot of and on the local setting. So I think what we have is we've got the potential for organisms. We've got a template or a distribution of habitats on the landscape that will potentially allow organisms to respond moving forward. I don't think we never even thought about climate change in '93 when we did this. Yeah.
Is there anything on the list that would make you think differently if you were to be locked in the pink tower again? And I'm sorry, I didn't mean to make you have flashbacks.
I mean, one of the things. One of the things we need to be thinking about is what is going to happen with climate change. And, we're looking at projection from 50,000 feet, but the reality is when you get down to the ground, the expression of climate change is going to vary tremendously. And I think that's another factor that needs to be considered in this landscape context. Is we know some places are inherently going to get warm. And if we're thinking in the future, what we want to do is make sure we got riparian areas in those particular places on the landscape that are going to help maintain or at least buffer the potential warming. If we're going to see more severe climatic events, are we going to see more landslides and debris flows on the landscape? Can we set the landscape up to be taking advantage of those type of things? So I think we've got that. Again, we've got the setup to do it. It's just how we move forward thinking about climate change is going to be the challenge.
And to add to that, NetMap has a climate change functions scenario playing in it, doesn't it?
Well, we're just beginning to look at that, and we're taking climate predictions in terms of snow level changes or the amount of runoff from snow versus non-snow features, and that's predicted to change because the snow line will increase. So you can take those predictions that are coming out of places like University of Washington Climate Impact Group, and you can bring them into the toolkit, and then it will give you a stream map of where the largest and the smallest changes of that flow regime, which means more frequent flooding in the winter because the snow line is increasing, or it's going to likely decrease summer low flows because you're getting rid of the snowmelt runoff. And you take that and then you overlay it upon the other maps, fish habitat maps, sedimentation zones, floodplains, and you can start seeing, or even roads, where in fact, if you're having more frequent flooding in the winter, where are your roads located in your floodplain? And with a click of a mouse now, you can find out where your floodplains are, defined by you in terms of their extent, and then you can just quickly look where the intersections are between floodplains and roads. So there are different ways to do it, and right now I would say it's fairly simple because you could get complicated hydrologic modeling inside, and I'm sure some people are doing that. But right now it's fairly straightforward.
Okay, a target wood quantities question. Aren't wood target quantities for upland and riparian areas determined by plan association? Is anybody looking at how plan association plays into wood, potential for wood delivery?
I just have a comment to that. There's been work in the Oregon Coast Range in unmanaged 150-year-old stands that in more of these confined valleys, but definitely a habitat to anadromous fish, that the near stream zone out maybe 5-10 meters is dominated by deciduous. And the big conifer wood, they don't want their feet down in the bottoms, and they're starting up on the toe slopes. So if you had a wood recruitment model that you would have that sensitivity built in, you would see the effect, and it would be by species. And the big wood from big conifers have to come in from further away, or they come in from debris flows. And one of the reasons why debris flows are big sources of wood in some parts of the Oregon Coast Range is because the near streamside zone is dominated by alders and maples, and they are not a source for big conifer wood, and that includes bank erosion sources, which can be big. So that's another reason why you can get 60–70% of wood coming from debris flows in some of these streams, which are in fact unmanaged.
We have really good plan association guides for riparian systems and upland systems. And to me, this is one where it seems like an interim cookie cutter guideline has become permanent, when it seemed to me in the plan that if we had, that there was some direction to fine-tune our target wood quantities from the plan association. Surely in places like the Siskiyou and the Umpqua Forest, you know, we have such a wide range of plan associations, but I thought that was another thing that we were supposed to fine-tune, and we ended up with this cookie cutter again forevermore.
So let me repeat that into the microphone. Rudy's question here has a little unhappy smiley face at the bottom about the interior.
Well,
Interim guidelines.
Can I address that? I
You-
mean, I think
you
there was
can.
an opportunity to do that, and it was called watershed analysis. And unfortunately, it never, you know, that hasn't happened. But that is exactly the type of stuff that was supposed to have happened, or we envisioned to happen in a watershed analysis. And I think, you know, going forward, that's some of the thinking that we should put into it.
But in the mid-90s, when that was kicking in, the technology wasn't there to actually calculate the wood recruitment. I mean, you could do it conceptually maybe, but if you want to do it now, you're much better off. And you could use the information that you're described in polygons in a GIS, overlay it with Sam's model that she presented this morning, and even run it for 1 year. You don't need to have 100-year forest growth predictions. If you have a map of forest type with the parameters that are important for wood recruitment, which is basically tree height, diameter, mortality rate, and tree lists, even for 1 year, you could put that in the model and see probably a fairly significant spatial variability in wood loading tied to your plant associations. So you'll be able to do things now that you weren't able to do 15 years ago.
So a comment here and then a question. It is refreshing to hear and know that concepts are presented addressing variable riparian reserve management. So even though we still have cookie cutter reserves, what we do inside of the reserves, people are hearing some variability and support for variability, which is good. The question is, if we know that one site fits all isn't working, will we see a Northwest Forest Plan Part 2? Consider environmental groups as partners in that development is the comment. So what are you guys hearing on the grapevine? Northwest Forest Plan 2.
Well, I think the challenge is it's right before us at the ONC lands. You know, that issue is going to raise this as one of the central themes of it. You know, because there's going to be a close examination, you know, a very thorough and complete examination of alternatives for managing managing federal lands in the ONC areas. And I can't imagine that the riparian issue isn't going to be front and center in that. So stay tuned.
I'll just add that, you know, all the forests are going through another round of plan revisions, and they're starting on the east side. They're going to be cycling around to the west side, and when they do, a lot of the analysis will be based on the new planning rule, and so I'm sure there will be new interpretations of the Northwest Forest Plan under the new planning regs as well. So stay tuned for that too.
So save that question for Lee Folliard and Jody at the panel at the end as well. Okay, this question I don't really get, so see if you can help. If we know that no-cut buffers at certain widths mitigate a loss of large woody debris and temperature increasing, why can't we get minimum no-cut buffers for 99% of our streams when we thin? So whoever's question this was, can you elaborate on this a bit? The person did a brain dump and left. Okay, we'll let it go, because I'm not sure I understand what it means, so.
I think it's just,
Do you
why
get it?
can't you have, they're asking why don't you have fixed width buffers, right? That no-cut buffers at certain widths mitigate the loss of wood and temperature, and why can't you have this minimum no-cut? I mean, that is the existing paradigm, more or less. Not on all lands, but certainly on federal lands and some state lands. It depends on the state, of course, because forest practice rules vary. But you could do that approach, but the argument has been, as far as I can understand from thinning, that you can move in nearer the stream, potentially, and still get a positive effect on the terrestrial environment. And if you want to actually put wood in the stream for mitigation or enhancement, you can, which would also eliminate the loss of wood by thinning. It's a mitigation or enhancement. So I mean, there's different parts of the story now, if that person's here or not. But
Okay. Last question. In terms of... No?
that was as bad as the question.
Did we give up? We're moving on?
I don't know how to, I mean, okay. I'm not even sure we know that no-cut buffers at certain widths can mitigate a loss of wood. I mean, that's a pretty strong statement, and I'm not sure there's agreement that that's what we definitely know.
Okay. All right, they're done cogitating. Last question. Yeah. This has to do with checkerboard ownership. In terms of having different ecological goals in different areas in a watershed, like BLM's checkerboard ownership already has that in terms of private land versus block ownership versus the block ownership of U.S. Forest Service lands. Any suggestions on differences in interpreting, allowing for different ecological characteristics on BLM lands versus U.S. Forest Service lands given time?
Given what?
Time. So over time, are the ecological processes comparable? If you got checkerboard versus large blocks?
I think one of the challenges is how do you, in terms of the BLM ownership is, are we trying to maintain the oasis in the desert, and how well are we doing at that? And are all the BLM checkerboards capable of being the oasis? I mean, from a fish perspective, when you start looking at the maps and looking at the details, they simply can't. They don't have the capacity. Or the refugia. No, that's what I mean when I say the oasis. I mean that certainly some of them can. Okay, now what you get out of that refugia is at the last. It's going to be very difficult to measure. But they certainly, some of them certainly can serve that, and others are not going to have the potential to do that. I mean, we can lock them up and walk away, and some of them simply just won't, at least from an aquatic perspective, are not going to make major contribution. So again, I know everybody hates to hear that, it depends, but it depends, in terms, on the context. And I think, one of the things we have now is we can move away from this idea that either one, we can't do anything everywhere, or we have to do everything everywhere. We can start to have this idea of, about understand this variability, understand this context, and begin to embrace it rather than dismiss it.
Okay. Well, we're going to move on to our practitioners. Help me thank these guys.